A Proper Celebration. Written by Werewolves Are Real. This is a Temeraire fanfiction, by the way. And read by Levitas
and Vali.
If Lawrence has any say, no one will ever know the exertion put toward the effort of getting Dover's aviators presentable for Lord Winsdale's goodwill celebration.
Do the men wear corsets too, sir?
Asks Cadet Dyers dubiously. Lawrence breathes in sharply, then closes his eyes.
No, they do not. But I've seen some men in Dover. We will have a discussion,
Lawrence says,
about the parts of Dover you have been frequenting.
Which fortunately forestalls that line of questioning. Emily's rather loud battle with her garments evoked this round of queries. She tugs at her bodice, red-faced and scowling, while Lawrence pointedly ignores her. When Admiral Lenton had taken him aside, asking him very carefully if he might not try to get his crew, and a few specific captains and senior officers who might also warrant invitations, familiar with the standards of good society in time for the round of banquets and celebrations sure to follow their momentous victory at Dover, Lawrence had thought very little before agreeing. After all, he will only need to assist the officers, and among them only the lower-ranked officers who merit invitations are those from Temeraire's own crew, since unfortunately the Celestial's exciting ability and his defeat of Napoleon's flying ships has not yet had the requisite month or two to fade into obscurity. It did not sound like a challenging task. "I think I lost a fork," says Cadet Sampson sadly.
"We only have the room reserved for another half hour,"
says Lawrence rather desperately.
"Cadet Roland, lace is expensive. Please do not—"
"It restricts my movements, sir."
"You do not need to move, you need to sit."
"If I sit, my dress flies up," Emily mutters. "I thought it was bad etiquette for people to see my underthings."
"That's what the lords like to say,"
says Dyers wisely.
"But you know they actually don't mind so much. I saw this older lady in Dover who kept pretending to drop things, and then when she'd bend down..." Lawrence
decides that he will have to ban Dyers from taking further liberty in the town. "Sir, are you entirely sure this fork and spoon stuff is real?" asks one of Berkeley's cadets for the third time. He waves a particularly dainty fork, still wearing his gloves. "And this thing is for oysters? Only I've never seen anyone around here."
"I assure you it is very real, cadet."
"I don't suppose Captain Harcourt knows about it then?"
"Or Captain Little."
"Or Captain Chenery." Emily tugs mutinously at her dress. "I bet my mum gets to wear pants," she mutters. And that's about the point where Lawrence realizes that things can, in fact, get worse.
"I think I lost a fork,"
says Captain Chenery.
"Perhaps we should move on to the dancing,"
Lawrence sighs. Chairs move away from the table in a chorus of squeals. They push the empty furniture toward the walls and leave a clear space in the center of the hall. Granby shoots Lawrence a commiserating look, but of course Temeraire's first lieutenant, for all his support, is no real help. As the third son of a coal merchant, he has exactly as many social graces as any other aviator, which is to say fewer than the average Englishman. Lawrence has no idea what most cadets are taught, but the Corps seems to have developed a hybrid culture all their own.
"At least we know this part,"
comments Captain Warren.
"I rather like dancing, and we should get Matthew here drunk. He'll start trying to waltz with the chairs."
"I haven't done that in years," Berkeley protests.
"No first names,"
Lawrence chides. "We can just take turns dancing with Roland and Harcourt," Sutton suggests. "At the actual event, I mean."
"If you keep me away from the other louts, I would be delighted,"
agrees the latter.
"You cannot dance with someone more than once."
Lawrence reasserts control, vaguely horrified.
"Oh, good,"
sighs Captain Warren.
"We'll just have to avoid dancing at all, then. You will have to dance or be thought rude."
Lawrence tries to keep the pain from his voice. Granby eyes him with a little alarm.
"And you cannot monopolize Jane, Roland, or Captain Harcourt."
"I don't see why not," says Captain Roland.
"But can we dance with each other instead?"
Warren asks.
"This event sounds rather dull,"
Chenery says. Lawrence is tired enough to tell him a bit too honestly.
"It is supposed to be dull."
Everyone nods as though this makes sense.
"Perhaps we should try to practice dancing itself."
The practice is a disaster. Lawrence informs the room twice that practicing with other men is fine. For the moment, they do not have enough women anyway.
"Although, Captain Little, you do not need to try leading once."
He despairs, eventually taking note of him and Granby, which is when he sees that Captain Harcourt has been pushing Warren in circles around the room for 20 minutes. Her form is so good he might never have noticed, and Warren is certainly enjoying himself. Lawrence would not presume to question fellow captains, but as several pairs sweep the room, clumsily, he takes an opportunity also to probe a few mid-wingmen.
"Mr. Shetland?"
he demands, startling one of Sutton's young officers.
How would you address a widowed lady if she wanted to dance with you? Dress?
He asks, momentarily confused.
What would you call her, Mr. Shetland? Oh, her name?
Shetland looks baffled. Seeing Lawrence's face, he tries...
Ma'am, sir.
What he concludes, he might have to go over titles and addresses again. When the aviators arrive, Captains Roland and Harcourt, so accustomed to their positions of seniority as formation leaders, precede the group into Lord Winsdale's hall with a dignified flourish of their dresses. Harcourt manages to walk without stumbling, a near miracle itself, but beyond the door their host and hostess eye the party aghast, as if to say, "Wherever are your manners?" and the tone is set from there.
Captain Lawrence,
Winsdale greets, plainly relieved when he enters. A few captains linger, and a few others seem to forget entirely his warnings about greeting the host, because they scatter straight into the room and gawk rather obviously at the opulent decorations. The Lord shakes his head and leans in with a bit too much familiarity.
Very good to see you, very good. How is your father? Well, thank you.
Lawrence catches a glimpse of Mr. Martin over his host's shoulder. The mid-wingman peers up at a painting and tilts the frame with interest. He hastens to add,
We are all honored by your thoughtfulness in arranging this event, my lord. Not at all. The least I can do for His Majesty's proud soldiers, eh?
Mr. Martin has now dropped the painting. Captain Sutton wanders over to pick it up and starts snickering at something. He's already smoking a cigar.
Yes,
Says Lawrence belatedly. When Winsdale frowns at him, he adds,
we were all glad to do our part. I am sure Bonaparte will think twice before making such an attempt again.
That, at least, is a sentiment anyone can support.
Quite so, quite so. Captain, in fact.
And to Lawrence's horror, he calls for a servant to bring 2 flutes of wine. Lawrence runs a hand over his face when the host isn't looking, then manages to accept the glass with a tight smile. More people, non-aviators, are filing into the hall. Lieutenant Hodgley stops a woman to gesticulate wildly at a vase. Lawrence watches in slow horror as it falls and splinters against the floor. Winsdale doesn't seem to notice.
One moment.
The Lord cries, tapping his glass. The hall hushes slowly.
I would like to propose a toast to all our brave aviators who risk their lives every day, dealing with savage beasts for the good of this great country. To the call!
A faint echo rises. Lawrence hastily lifts his own glass. The aviators in the hall seem plainly unimpressed. "Very nice," he hears one of the lieutenants mutter nearby. "But I would quite prefer something a bit more stiff if we're stuck entertaining this lot. Can't we toast with something decent?"
Ha!
Another officer answers.
They don't think we're worth it, of course.
Winsdale does hear that comment, judging by the way his mouth tightens. Another party arrives, and the awkward lord uses the excuse to make his departure. Sensing a similar opportunity in this distraction, the cadets scatter for the side doors, with the notable exception of poor Emily Roland in her tangle of skirts. Lawrence strongly suspects they have run outside to do some mischief, hopefully away from the other guests. Sutton and his first lieutenant pair up to glance warily at some women, muttering. Lawrence assumes they are trying to figure out how to approach, but they only manage to look menacing. Lieutenant Hobbs, apparently under the impression that the appetizer table is the main course, gathers up an absurd collection of forks and spoons before eating his tiny finger sandwiches, and Lawrence glimpses a delighted man from the Foreign Office being led around the floor in odd patterns by Captain Roland, with complete disregard to the present lack of music. Lenton appears by his side. His formal admiral's dress uniform gleams very appropriately in the hall's gathered lights.
Should say this is going well,
he decrees, sipping at some wine.
Blessed that it isn't a formal dinner, mind. Last time we had a large group invited to one of those, Captain Everett from my old formation, he fell asleep in his pudding, and Lieutenant Leslie tore up her skirts trying to fetch some clothes, not to mention how some of the midwingmen start to gossip when they get in their cups.
Lawrence reminds himself that his company will probably not reflect poorly on Lord Allendale. Most people already consider him rather estranged from the respectable Lawrences. His mood cheers slightly when he sees Harcourt charming a few men in the corner, and after some maneuvering, Lenton gathers the younger officers around him like a flock of hatchlings all looking for food. They trail along and speak obediently to anyone he gestures toward. Well, perhaps the evening will not be an entire disaster. Sir? Lawrence pauses at the interruption. He turns slowly and manages to ask with something approaching calm.
Is there a problem, Mr. Martin?
Well, no, Martin lies. Except that some of us decided to take a look at the stables, and possibly one of the horses escaped, sir. You know, he was very big, almost as big as a Winchester. I didn't know horses could get that. Lawrence presses a hand to his face.
I will be outside shortly,
he manages, and then, noticing a new commotion, adds,
Pray go relieve Captain Sutton from the tables before he drinks any more wine.
Martin looks over critically. Might be easier to just give him more wine, he just sleeps it off, he suggests, and leaves Lawrence to his misery.
Well,
Granby says after.
That could have gone worse.
Lawrence levels him with a flat look and unravels his cravat.
Pray tell me how.
Granby winces, considers.
No one was arrested,
he suggests. Lawrence does not dignify this with a response. He sags against Temeraire, slipping off his coat without care for the impropriety. Neither John nor the Celestial mind, and there is no need to be careful here. Unlike at the party, where no one but Lawrence seemed very concerned about the behavior anyway.
It's not so bad,
Granby coaxes.
We promised to pay them back for the horses.
You should have let me along after all, Lawrence,
Temeraire reproaches.
See, I would not have lost any horses, and if that one had still died, I could have eaten it instead of letting it be wasted.
My dear,
Lawrence says,
I would gladly go anywhere with you, but I would prefer we only have happy experiences together.
I have heard it was a rather boring party,
Temeraire allows, which is not quite what he meant.
Oh, look, it is Lillian Harcourt.
Lawrence turns around as a huge longwing squeezes herself into Temeraire's clearing. She stands tensed on half-bowed legs, ready to take new flight at any moment.
Hello, Lawrence, John.
Harcourt is still wearing her dress, sitting awkwardly on his side.
We decided it was a bit of a waste to put these fancy clothes away so soon, and anyway, the dragons like them, don't you, love?
You look very nice, Lily approves, glancing back with one large yellow eye. I think all your outfits should sparkle so.
Quite right. We're flying out to the big clearing a few miles off the town, where the men had played ball 2 months back, remember? I think the lads convinced Berkeley to do some singing.
I didn't know Berkeley could sing,
says Granby with surprise.
He can't!
Harcourt grins.
Oh, let us go,
Temeraire says.
I think I would quite like a party with our friends.
So, of course, Lawrence has to go. This party is quite different. The dragons ring the clearing in happy clumps, chatting quietly and tilting their heads as bit of lute and a rustic violin are drawn from the more artistic aviators. Lawrence belatedly remembers his mussed uniform and missing cravat, but half the crowd is worse dressed than he. The remnants from Lord Winsdale's gathering are dressing in only bits and pieces of finery. Emily has torn her dress past the knees with complete disregard for its finery, but no one seems to notice. And while Temeraire bows his head to peer at a few drunken men sprawled on the ground, Jane Rowland comes and finds him. For all your talk of dancing, she says, I never saw you on the floor, Will. And this seems to be an invitation, because without anything further, she grabs his arm. Lawrence finds himself being led in a bizarre, fast-paced circle that utterly dismisses the music, and to his own surprise, he finds himself smiling too, as well-meaning onlookers start to jeer. Perhaps it isn't such a bad thing to ignore etiquette.
Well,
says Admiral Lenton much later, philosophical.
At least it is unlikely we'll have to endure any more invitations.
The officers and their dragons are invited to a party that very next day. Lawrence, quite appropriately, confiscates some whiskey from his subordinates and starts preparing new lessons.